Hi everyone, and welcome to another Heroes and Bosses video. This time I'm going to be painting the Overseer from Massive Darkness. As I do with most large miniatures, I'll be using two colors of primer. I'm first spraying the entire miniature with Chaos Black, and then just a light spray of Corax White from above at a 45-degree angle. The Overseer has a lot of hard to reach places, so I'm going to paint those first. I'm first going to create a dark pink flesh color using Khardic Flesh from P3 and Screamer Pink from Games Workshop. Screamer Pink is a very intense color, so you don't need a whole lot of it. I'm going to be mixing this in a 3-to-1 ratio of Khardic Flesh and Screamer Pink. The Overseer has a kind of bony carapace over most of the body, but in between that there's folds of flesh. This is what I'm using the flesh color on to start with. Now it's inevitable you're going to hit other parts of the mini with this color, but I'm not worried about it. That's why I'm doing this color first. I'm also using this color around the eye sockets and on the mouth parts. In some places it gets hard to tell which is bone and which is flesh. Really, that's up to you. At this stage, if you change your mind, it's pretty easy to switch the colors. I'm also painting around the tops of all the tentacles, and later I'll just blend this into the tentacle color. So here's what we have so far. For the next part, I'm going to create 3 colors for the tentacles. This is the only place I'm really taking advantage of the two-tone prime. So on my wet palette, I have 3 pools of my light Calgar Blue and a small pool of Khorne Red and Caledor Sky. I'm going to take a small amount of the Khorne Red and Caledor Sky and mix it into one of the pools of the Calgar Blue to make a slightly darker purplish blue. For the last pool, I'm going to take slightly more of both the red and the dark blue and mix those into the Calgar Blue to make an even darker purplish blue. Once that's done, I have a light, medium, and dark shade that all kind of mesh well together. Now if mixing your own shades like this isn't your cup of tea, then just say screw it, paint all the tentacles with pure Calgar Blue. With the two-tone prime, you're still going to get a noticeable difference in hue. So now, using the black and white primer as a guide, I'm painting all of the light areas with pure Calgar Blue. You're probably noticing right now that the pink and blue really clash with each other at this point. We're going to fix that later in a pretty simple way, but for now, I'm just getting the tentacles completely covered. Once that's done, I'm going to go over all the areas that were black with the dark blue mix. It's pretty easy to tell where these were, even if you forgot what you were doing and painted over the black. The undersides of all the tentacles and anywhere they start to curve onto the ground or up into the body are getting covered with the dark blue. I've got my dark blue thinned down to a glaze at this point, and I'm just going to keep adding thin layers to darken up the undersides of the tentacles. Any places where the dark and light blue start to overlap, I'll switch to the medium blue to blend the two together. Otherwise, I'm not using the medium blue at all. And this doesn't have to be a perfectly smooth looking transition, because later on we're going to be blending everything together with a wash. For all the thin, squirmy looking tentacles, I'm just going to go back to the original flesh color that we mixed earlier. The last thing I'm going to do with the flesh color is to start blending it into the blue. All around the underside of the carapace is going to be painted with the flesh color, but I'm only going to brush upwards from the blue into the pink. This is going to make the paint thinnest in the blue areas and thickest near the carapace. And once again, I'm not trying to make this perfect, since it's going to be smoothed out later. All along the underside of the tentacles, there's a ridged area right down the center, pretty much where you'd find the suckers on octopus tentacles. I'm painting this area with Genestealer Purple from Games Workshop. Next I'm going to paint the carapace using a light tan color. I'm using Hammerfall Khaki, but it's pretty much identical to Carrick Stone. There's a lot of tiny pits and grooves in the carapace, so I've thinned my paint down to about half water so I don't cover any of these up. I'm also using a huge brush for most of it because there's a lot of area to cover. I'd say the person who designed this mini was into sea creatures, because this looks like a mashup of a mantis shrimp, an octopus, a sea urchin, and a coral reef. Once the top part's finished, I'm going to switch to a smaller brush just to fill in all the tighter areas. Next, I'm painting all the bony coverings on his front appendages, including the mantis blades, using Screaming Skull. Now when I'm painting the arm plates, I'm not trying to get my brush way up under his shell. It's primed black in there, and rather than have to shade that area in later, I'm just leaving it black. The Overseer also has 4 large teeth in the front, and I'm using Screaming Skull on these as well. Okay, so he's looking pretty cartoony and not very intimidating yet, but we're going to fix that soon. Next I'm going to do some shading using 2 different shades, Carroburg Crimson and Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm using pure Carroburg Crimson on all the flesh in his carapace and on his arm joints, but not any part of the tentacles. I'm going to do this in 2 stages, starting with the front of the Overseer. I'm trying not to hit any part of the bone colored paint, but I definitely did in a few spots. I'll touch that up later though. After I've completely covered the front flesh of the Overseer, I'm then going to lay it down and let that wash sink down into the grooves of the flesh and dry. For all the tentacles and flesh that's connected to the tentacles, I'm making a light purple wash using 3 parts Carroburg Crimson and 1 part Drakenhof Nightshade. Just to let you know in advance, I am not highlighting the tentacles after the wash. We already did that. This wash is to blend all of those pinks and blues together. For this part, you may want to do 1 tentacle at a time. What you don't want to do is miss a spot on a tentacle because it's really hard to fix that later if the wash is already dried. So as you can probably see, the wash is tinting both the blue and the pink areas more towards purple, so spots where the pink and blue meet look more blended than before. If you have the problem of accidentally leaving a pool of wash somewhere and now you have a dark spot on your blue tentacles, you can fix that. If you mix a small amount of Screamer Pink into Calgar Blue, you can match the new color of the tentacle pretty well. Next I'm going to shade all the bone areas except the blades with Agrax Earthshade. I'm also using the Agrax Earthshade for the teeth. Once all that's completely dried, I'm going to go back to the Hammerfall Khaki and do a dry brush of all the bone areas. For the arm plates, I'm only dry brushing the edges of the plates and the top surface to brighten it up. For this first dry brush of the carapace, I'm going to hit every part of it. Next I'm going to mix an equal amount of Ivory from Vallejo into the Hammerfall Khaki and dry brush the top half of the carapace and the top surfaces of the arm plates. Here you can see a comparison of the pure Hammerfall Khaki with the brighter version. I'm being a little more selective with this dry brush. As I said, I'm doing the top half of the carapace, but then I'm going to switch to a smaller brush and then dry brush the smaller edges around the face and on the arms. Next I'm going to paint the arm blades so that they transition from pretty much white at one end to black at the other. If you've never done this, I'm going to show you a quick and easy way to get a decent result. The first thing you need to do is put out 4 colors. I'm using Screaming Skull, Steel Legion Drab, Dryad Bark, and Abaddon Black. You don't need a wet palette for this, but if you're not using one, just water your paints down to at least 50% water. So the first thing you want to do is mark out our 4 colored regions, starting with the Steel Legion Drab. You see how thin that paint is? I screwed up. Don't do that. There's too much water on my brush. So right now I'm painting the bottom 2/3 of every blade with Steel Legion Drab. Next, go halfway up on the Steel Legion Drab and paint that with Dryad Bark. And finally, go to the halfway point in the Dryad Bark and paint that with black. And here's what we have so far. You can clearly see the 4 colors. Now, starting with the brightest color, go to roughly the halfway point on the next color, in this case Steel Legion Drab. Paint from the brown to the white with every stroke, just adding a single thin layer. I'm rinsing off the brush and wiping it on a towel, then getting Steel Legion Drab on it. Then I'm painting from halfway up the Dryad Bark to the Steel Legion Drab. And finally, I'll clean the brush again and get Dryad Bark on it. Then, same as before, painting from the black into the Dryad Bark. So you can see, even after 1 layer of each color in this process, the blending is already pretty good. If you want to make it better, you can let it dry and then add more paint where you think it'll improve the blending. In some places, you may even want to wet blend the colors a bit where they meet. This isn't the final step, however, though the final step is the easiest. If you watched my last video, you may remember me saying that you almost never would put a pre-made wash onto a wet palette. Well, this is one of those times. I'm mixing a bit of water with some Agrax Earthshade. This is the final step in the blending process. I'm going to add a slightly thinned down brown wash over the blades, and this will smooth out the transitions between the colors. And as you can see here, I'm adding wash to the entire blade, and afterwards I'm not highlighting. This wash is to blend the colors together, not to create shadows. So hopefully when you're done, your blades look something like this. While I've got the Screaming Skull on my palette, I'm also going to highlight the teeth. I'll first add a layer of pure Screaming Skull. After that, I'm going to add in about an equal amount of Ivory and then put on a smaller layer near the tips of the teeth. Next, I'm going to do a small amount of highlighting on the fleshy areas. I'm making another mix of Khardic Flesh and Screamer Pink, but this time I'm going to go a bit lighter, about a 4-to-1 mix instead of a 3-to-1. I'm going to start off with a dry brush, and for this I'm going to use a small tipped flat brush because there's some narrow areas on the miniature I need to get into. So the areas I'm going to focus on are around the face and the joints in the arms. Being super careful, of course, not to hit anything but flesh with this pink. I'm doing the really thin folds up inside the carapace, but the bigger ones I'm leaving alone for now. So for the few bigger areas, I'm going to mix a little water in with the same paint, and then switch to a sharp tip brush. There's only a few spots that I'm using this brush for, like the top folds of flesh in the center of the head, and a few spots around the front eyes and next to the teeth. Okay, time for the eyes. Typically eyes are the hardest thing to paint on a mini, not so in this case. I'm starting off by covering these eyes in 2 layers of ivory. Now don't stress about getting the eye to look perfectly white. Most of the eye is getting another color on top of this one. The most important part to cover is the back third of the eye. Next, I'm painting the outline of the iris using Abaddon Black. I'm starting off with a small circle on each eye and then widening it. I can't tell you how tempting it was to leave all the eyes looking like big googly eyes. Once all your eyes are ready, it's time to make them look a little more intimidating. I'm going to go for a demonic looking eye using these 4 colors. So first I'm starting off with a 1-to-1 mix of Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet. I'm painting this over the entire iris except for a very thin line of black all around the rim. Here you can see I'm just nudging my brush closer and closer to the edge of the iris, making that black edge as thin as possible but without going over. Next I'm switching to Wild Rider Red, which is actually a dark orange, and I'm going to paint a starburst pattern in the eye. Just start near the edge of the red circle and paint a line inward to the center. Then do that all around the eye. For the larger eyes, I'm doing a smaller starburst pattern in the center of the eye, about half the size of the first one. Next I'm painting the pupil of the eye. Now there's no reason why you can't do a circular pupil for this, just make a circle instead of a slit, and all the other steps are exactly the same. In fact, if anyone does do a circular pupil for this, I'd love to see it. The final step is to make the edges of the pupil stand out. For this I'm using Cygnus Yellow from P3. Just get a small amount on your brush and then make tiny dots all around the edges of the pupil. And last, I'm just going to do a little touch-up on the pupil with a little more black. And these eyes are pretty exposed, so I think they should look a bit yellowed and even bloodshot in some places. I'm first using Seraphim Sepia mixed with an equal amount of water. This stuff has a lot of staining power, so you definitely need to water it down. Start near the black edge of the eye and brush towards the socket. This will make a nice yellowish tint to the eye. For the rest of the eyes, I did them production line style, first painting on all the red, then the starbursts, and then the pupils. Next up is the base. I'm doing a very simple flagstone pattern on the base. If you want more detailed information on how this is done, it's the same as all my other Massive Darkness miniatures, but here's the quick and dirty. I start off by covering the entire base with Mechanicus Standard Grey. Next, using a pure black, I paint on a basic rectangular floor pattern. Then, using 2 or 3 different shades of grey, created by mixing browns and blacks into the Mechanicus Standard Grey, I color in random flagstones. And finally, I mix about half and half grey and black and paint all around the rim of the base. Let that dry and seal the whole thing with your choice of matte varnish. The final step for the eye is to create a reflective looking surface. There's 2 ways you can do this. You can paint white glints into the edges of the pupils, or you can cover the eye in a gloss varnish. I much prefer the gloss varnish, but that's a matter of personal choice. I just like how it retains that wet look, and I think you can see that the eye really comes alive after this is applied. By the way, always mix your gloss varnish with water. This stuff starts to clump pretty quickly once it starts to dry. The gloss varnish I'm using here is Ard Coat from Games Workshop. And there you have it, the Overseer from Massive Darkness. A very special thank you to all my patrons who inspire me to make these videos. Your support is very much appreciated. There's a lot more to come from Green Horde and Massive Darkness. If you want to be part of the community and vote on which mini to paint next, come check me out on Patreon. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you very much for watching.